This is Jamie Drummond for Good Food Revolution. I'm joined today by none other than vigneron Ken Forrester, who normally joins us from Stellenbosch, but right now is joining us from a world tour of the US, and he is currently in Connecticut. How are you today, Ken?
Jamie, it is a bit of a world tour. Connecticut today, Boston tomorrow, New York on Monday. We're getting around, getting to see the highways and byways and meet a lot of old friends and some new friends. It's wonderful. Always magical to be in the trade, in the market.
Superb. Well, I missed you when you were in Toronto, but I'm very happy today to be seeing you online, to be tasting through an old favorite of mine. This is your Old Vine Reserve Chenin Blanc, the 2022 vintage, which I always feel is one of the very best value whites in the LCBO because it punches well above its weight in every vintage I've ever tasted. So tell us the story behind this one, because it's a gorgeous wine.
Jamie, that's kind of you. We set about in 1993. I bought the vineyard. Mr. Mandela was out of jail. South Africa was going headlong into its first democratic elections in April 94. And in November 93, I found this derelict vineyard in Stellenbosch, in the heart of the winelands, which had initially been planted in 1689.
Good Lord.
The first vines were planted there. And this derelict property, I simply couldn't believe somebody owned this property and didn't love it or care for it.
Right.
And it was on auction, and we bought it, a rescue process. My kind wife stood by me with two young daughters, and we semigrated from Johannesburg to Cape Town and took up residence, rebuilt the homestead, and reworked the vineyards. And I went to France. I went to go work with Bernard Germain, a real legend, a true legend of a man, way ahead of his time, 30 years ago when I went to go see him. And he was in Tourcé, just outside Angers, at Chateau de Fel. And Chateau de Fel was predominantly a producer of sweet wine of note. And they'd also made some dry wines. And working with Bernard in the cellar, I was absolutely intrigued to see him fermenting Chenin Blanc in 400-liter French oak barrels, about 20% new. I took to this idea immediately as a point of difference, as a way to change the kind of concept of Chenin Blanc, to find a more meaningful role for Chenin Blanc, and went back home to South Africa to be met with a certain amount of not praise, to be exact,
derision.
Skepticism,
Right.
derision from my mates and colleagues, who one of them even commented, like, mate, you're putting Chenin Blanc into French oak, and you've come from Johannesburg. I hope you bought a return ticket, because you're not going to be around that long. This is like fatal.
Now, you have to explain for those people who don't know what the role of Chenin was at that time in South Africa.
30 years ago, Chenin Blanc was, very much as it has been in many parts of the world, the absolute workhorse grape.
Yeah.
It was a willing producer. It would produce a good volume of grapes. It had a high natural acidity, which tended to help with winemaking procedures. You could use it, distill it for brandy. You could distill it for neutral spirit.
Yeah.
You could just about do virtually anything, and it was a good yielder, good yielding grape. So it was favored and liked. And in fact, it's a universal thing. You know, California, if you go back and see when the first Chardonnay was planted in California, you'd be surprised to note that it was not until the kind of mid-70s.
Yes. Yep.
And way before then, in California, people like Gallo, Paul Masson were doing white Burgundy and Chablis.
Which was
Chenin Blanc. What do you think that was? That was Chenin Blanc.
Vast majority.
Chenin Blanc. Yeah. Chenin Blanc plantings in California were vast. Chenin Blanc was about 20% of the Californian vineyard at one point. You know, and people just pretend it never happened in America. Oh, yes, it did. And it was white Burgundy and Chablis. I mean, get a load of that. Chenin Blanc, Chablis. However,
when was your first vintage where you used some new oak on your Chenin Blanc?
This was in 1994.
Okay.
95 was our first vintage. 1995, and we looked at that, and quite honestly, we couldn't afford barrels for the whole vintage. So I decided we'd go half of the grapes would be barrel fermented, with 20% of that being in new oak.
Right.
And the other half would be tank fermented. And there was some method in my madness, in as much as I recognized from an early stage, not having gone to any wine school or formal education in the viticulture, but I worked out pretty quickly that there was morning sun and afternoon sun. And if your rows are running north-south, everything on the eastern side of your row will get morning sun, and everything on the western side will get afternoon sun.
Right.
And the difference in temperature, morning to afternoon, is vast. 9 a.m., 10 a.m. in the morning versus 3 p.m., 4 p.m. in the afternoon, different game.
Yeah.
And that makes a difference to the ripeness of the fruit. And to that end, to this day, 30 years later, we harvested two sides of the vineyard at different times, about a week apart, everything harvested by hand.
You say two sides of the vineyard, you mean two sides of the vine?
Of the vine, I beg your pardon.
No, make sure I was on the same page.
Yeah, quite right. Absolutely. Two sides of the vine. And we harvest all of the cool morning fruit about a week or 10 days later than the afternoon fruit.
Right. Okay.
And to that end, that afternoon fruit, where if you look at the bunch, the actual bunch has already a little suntan on it. It's a little golden in color.
Yes, yep.
However, if you pick that bunch up, the back of the bunch is still olive green because it's seen no sunshine. So every one of those bunches on the western side is a variable package of grapes. And I wanted to take that variation and consolidate it that I could manage it. So I put all of those western grapes in a tank, a stainless steel tank, where I can control the fermentation temperature,
yes,
drag it down to about 18 degrees Celsius, and ensure that I get a cool fermentation. That cool fermentation preserves the fruit quality and the fruit flavors. So we're preserving that apple, crunchy, green, pear, white fruit capacity of the wine. And then the second part, we go back and harvest on the eastern side. None of that fruit sees much direct sunshine. That gets crushed, left for a couple of hours on the skins, just a little bit of skin contact, and then pressed and drained in a tank overnight. And the following day, some fairly cloudy juice in the tank is run into barrels to start a spontaneous wild yeast fermentation.
And what do you believe that barrel component, particularly the new oak component, brings to the wine, the eventual wine?
You know, it's very interesting. The new oak component certainly is the hard stuff to work with.
Yes, yeah.
That's the phenolic, vanillin, those vanilla flavors, and all of those kind of fairly hard flavors. Hence, we don't have too much new oak, 20%. And also the fact that these are 400-liter, as the French would say, they're 400-liter fût. It's not a barrique. And so that fût allows far more volume, 400 liters, versus the surface area of the barrel is a far less concentration of oak in the wine than a 225-liter barrel. It would give you a far more oak concentration in the wine. The barrel, essentially for me, is a wonderful French word that we don't even translate easily into English.
Élevage. Yes, yeah, I knew that was where you were going. Yes.
and élevage is, in English, to raise up, to educate, to teach, to train, to improve. There's no single word for it.
Yes.
It's very hard to define in one word. But élevage is, for me, about the wonderful ballet of oxygen which takes place inside the barrel. And when I say the ballet of oxygen, imagine that barrel is a sealed unit. It appears sealed because we see no dripping, no waste, nothing on the floor. However, it's not entirely hermetic. Between the staves of the barrel, you will get the ingress of oxygen in a molecular fashion. So oxygen, our little O2 molecule, will come into the barrel. And as this fellow comes into the barrel, he's looking for somebody to bind with. He's looking for a friend. And the most easy, this barrel, being oak, is cellulose. It therefore has a positive charge, which is perfect for our oxygen. He likes that positive environment, and he'll now find and pick up a desperately, seriously kind of lonely tannin in the form of, in red wine, an anthocyanin, but in white wine, he'll go for one of the tannin structures that are lying around and find a tannin to bind with. And he'll find another tannin because he's an O2, so he can bind with two tannins. These three molecules are now too heavy to stay in suspension. This thread now is this polymer that can no longer stay in suspension, and it'll start to settle. But this is occurring 1 million times a day. And you've got multiple threads, all in different angles in the wine, all settling. Imagine a fine mesh net settling slowly through the wine. We think the settling process takes about 3 months in a barrel. But what happens is during that period in the barrel, your wine clarifies entirely, that if you were to test that wine 3 months later in the oak barrel, it is crystal clear.
Yes.
If you were to have a stainless steel barrel right alongside that oak barrel under the same conditions, 3 months later, your wine would be murky in the stainless steel.
Turbidity like crazy, right? So it would be,
correct. That natural ballet of oxygen, for me, is really what I love the barrel for, and hence my kind of penchant for older barrels. However, to get older barrels, I need to start with some younger barrels at some point. And so we build up our older barrel stock, but we're always introducing new oak. And the new oak certainly adds definition to the wine, structure, definition, and we've got to be careful. I'm always concerned. The question sitting in my mind is, which part of terroir is the barrel? To my mind, which part of terroir is the barrel? It's no part of terroir. The terroir should shine without the oak. If the wine is completely hidden by the oak, you destroyed the terroir. And we really don't ever want to see that picture.
I understand. Now, I was looking over my various tasting notes of this wine over the vintages, and the one word that comes up every single time, and this is over the course of God knows how many vintages now, is texture. How is this wine, or how would be the correct question? How is this wine so marvelously textured? It has such a great weight and mid-palate on it. That would be down to this barrel component, I would imagine, somewhat.
There's elements of that. That little bit of skin contact that we give the one half will give us texture. The fact that we only semi-settle the wine, it's a short settling process. Literally, it'll be a 14, 18-hour settling process. So the wine is not settled clear, which really was frowned upon by a number of my colleagues in the industry. But I love that concept of working with a lot of protein in the wine, because that finally becomes texture. You end up, those are textures that you're binding. And textures, I think we don't talk about texture often enough in wine. I think texture is a critical aspect of the way we taste. And if I think, and I say to people, of all the foods that you really do love and the food that you don't love, I'll tell you it's not about the flavor, it's about texture. And that's 99% true.
Well, where I find this wine really comes into its own is to do with that textural component, but also with the way that interplays with the white fruit aromatic, particularly the pear aromatic. So for me, it's almost, if I close my eyes, I can almost imagine a kind of pear nectar type thing going on with the texture there. Just that beautiful, I'm not going to say grainy, because it's not grainy, because it's actually quite unctuous and lush. But there's definitely something of the pear texture in here, in the glass, every single time I have some.
I love that. It's just magic. I think that's something we strive for, and it's delicate. One has to be very, very careful about overplaying texture, because texture has to be there, but it shouldn't be playing the leading role. It should be
correct. Yes.
The reassurance.
Now this comes in at 13.5. So it's not shy, but I don't think it tastes boozy in any way whatsoever. I think the fruit carries it wonderfully, the acidity, of course. What do you believe the old vines bring to this?
The old vines, without a doubt, bring me concentration. There's no doubt whatsoever that what we're looking at here, and for us, that concentration is textural, that concentration is flavoral, It's the intensity of the pear nectar of the apples, and it's also the richness of the wine comes from old vines. Young vines, I have to say, are not to be knocked. I mean, I really do love, and we make a wine in another style, a petit Chenin, which is a fun, everyday, easy drinking wine. And for me, the essence of that wine is young fruit, young vines, just like college kids. I mean, they can party all night. I mean, they play, they're exuberant, they're fun. And that's what that wine is. Really, it's exuberant and fun. Here we're looking at something a little more serious, a little more lush, a little more luxury, a little more accustomed to the kind of comforts.
The better things in life.
I would think so. I would think so.
And where would you see this at the dinner table? You've traveled all over with this wine. And over the years, what have been the most successful pairings with this wine? I know it changes slightly from vintage to vintage, but in general, what have been your most successful pairings with this?
I've always loved this wine with grilled shrimp. If you take shrimp and give it a lovely garlic butter sauce, and even add a little bit of chopped jalapeno, some chili, some peppers to that. And this wine loves spice. And you can put this wine in front of a mild curry. You can give this wine a mussel curry, for example, with a kind of lovely flavor to it, and it'll pick up that heat. And when you challenge Chenin with heat, it returns fruit. It's generous. It's wonderfully generous. And not to compare, but if you took Sauvignon Blanc and challenged the spiky, steely flavor of Sauvignon Blanc with heat, you're going to end up with a minor explosion.
Yeah, you just get that harshness of the Sauvignon character.
I would say to people, Chenin Blanc with curry is the ideal choice. The kind of contrast that I have is people will say, oh, but what about Gewürztraminer? I don't believe that's a great idea. I think Chenin Blanc really works way better because of the acidity of Chenin and because of the fruit and the fact that the flavors that respond are soft and gentle. It almost restores your palate, resets your palate.
Right. This is such a gorgeous wine. I'm now torn between what I'm going to cook to go with the Cap Classique Sparkle Horse or with this. We're going to have to work that one out this afternoon. Ken Forrester, thank you very much for joining us at Good Food Revolution once again. All the best of luck with the rest of your US travels, and hopefully we will see you in Ontario at some time in the not too distant future.
Jamie, we're programmed to come and visit you in Ontario. We have a big program. It's a group of us coming out to see you in June next year.
Oh, fantastic.
We're set up. It's all set up, and we're looking forward to seeing you out there at that stage. And thank you, Edward, for your time.
Excellent. Take care. Bye for now, sir.
Thanks. Yes, thank you.